Hey there, my name is Jane. I'm a watercolor painter and a teacher. And if you wanted to learn something about watercolor painting, then this is a good place. In this first episode of my new watercolor mini series, I will talk about art materials that you need to start with watercolor. It will be art materials for practice, but they will not fail you and also won't cost you a fortune. And I put this video together with the intention to help you to ease the struggle and the hustle to get the proper tools so that you can focus on the actual painting faster. So let's see what we actually need for a watercolor painting. Firstly, you will need a good watercolor paper to start with. And the quality that we are looking for is probably not gonna be the cheapest paper that you get from a supermarket, but it doesn't have to be expensive. Look for a paper that is no less than 300 GSM and cold press, which means that it has slight texture that will actually help you to control your water. I have great experience with Fabriano papers because they are cheap and very high quality, as well as Canson or Strathmore. If you have higher budget, you can also invest in 100% cotton papers, and these papers will really reward you. You will feel the difference when working with watercolor, but in my experience they get quite expensive, probably 4 or 5 times more than regular wood pulp or cellulose paper, so this might not be the option for everyone from the start. My tip is also to avoid using hot pressed watercolor papers at the start of your watercolor journey, since they get quite difficult to handle at the start and it might just discourage you from using watercolor. Papers that have texture, they don't suck the paint in so quickly, so you get more time to work with your paint. You will appreciate the cold press texture. Next thing you'll need are good watercolor brushes, and by good I don't necessarily mean expensive. A good watercolor brush is soft and it can hold a lot of water while still remaining the tip. The round brush for watercolor should be a very universal tool. However, the larger the brush, the more expensive it will be, and most expensive brushes are made out of natural bristles. I prefer the mix of natural and synthetic bristles. They are much less expensive, but you won't really notice drop in quality. What I usually recommend to beginners is 2 or 3 watercolor brushes, with one being the largest round brush for covering largest areas. The other one should be a smaller watercolor brush that can still hold quite enough water, but should have a sharp tip to fit into corners that the larger brush can't really cover. And in your watercolor toolbox, you should have one last brush that is very small, cheap, made of synthetic bristles, and can draw the tiniest lines. You can also use it for writing and really very tiny details. This is a quick example of brushes that are not suitable for watercolor, so anything with very stiff bristles will just scratch your paper and will not allow you to fully experience the watercolor technique. And these brushes also can't really hold water, so you would have to constantly load your brush with new paint. We did talk about round brushes, but what about flat brush? Well, flat brush for watercolor is the one that also has soft bristles, but you don't necessarily need it right from the start. I use it purely to paint architecture, so you can get it later. This is a water brush. That's another thing that is made of synthetic bristles and can be filled with water. This can come in handy when painting outside, but they usually get more expensive than the detailed brush. You can basically use it for the same purpose, which is painting details. Personally, usually just prefer the detailed brush that costs no more than €1.50. There is really tons of watercolor brushes of all shapes and sizes on the market, and at the start you might feel the pressure to acquire a full range of tools to cover every possible need that you could have, but trust me, from the start there won't be much that you can't do with those 3 brushes that I just described. Here's a little tip on how to take care of your brush. Just use clean and cold water to get rid of all the pigment that your brush may hold. And gently squeeze the water out of your brush and form a tip with your finger. Put it in a glass or jar, head up, and simply let it dry naturally. Never use hot water for painting or for cleaning your brush. I saved watercolor paints for last because paper and quality brushes are actually much more key to learning watercolor technique at start than having the best quality watercolor. So don't stress out too much about paints, and I will show you a couple of options to get you started. I consider a small set of watercolor pens in a starter's box to be highly practical, and that is for a couple of reasons. Pens are filled with dry paint and are instantly ready for use, and the amount of color used in these small palettes won't overwhelm you and will definitely encourage learning to mix your own colors. The box itself contains usually a plastic palette for color mixing, and it is closable and transferable wherever you go. Even later on, when you are more experienced watercolorist and you'll get higher quality studio paints, you will still be able to benefit from owning such box, use it outdoors, for studies, traveling, or even replace the original or used up pens with colors of your own choice. The amount of brands that make watercolor paints is so overwhelming these days that it might be very difficult for you to choose. I wouldn't stress too much about it. Any watercolor that has decent amount of pigment and uses gum arabic or honey as a binder is just fine. Student lines of paints such as Winsor & Newton Cotman, Van Gogh or Sennelier will work well with all the techniques that you might want to try. Please try to avoid children's watercolor unless you have no other option, or hobby type of watercolor that actually contains very little pigment and is very dry. I would be careful because these paints sometimes get very expensive, more expensive than the student line sets that I showed you previously. I also wouldn't recommend starting off with watercolors that are made with different binders or are not traditional Western watercolors, such as, for example, Korotaki, Gansai, Tambi paints. And it's not that these are bad paints, it's just that due to the structure of these paints, they might react differently. You might get very different results when trying certain techniques. Western watercolors are very transparent and usually do not stain so aggressively, and a lot of techniques count on these particular properties. By the way, you can also get watercolor tubes, and there is a couple of pros and cons. For example, you can only purchase about 6 tubes and a closable empty palette, and besides, this can give you quite a freedom over your color choices. Tube paint from most manufacturers works either wet or dry. You can re-wet it even if you have leftovers on your palette. But tubes are kinda hard to use outdoors, and paint preparation takes a bit of a hassle, and one badly closed cap can cost you a whole bunch of paint going dry inside the tube and therefore unusable, so it's up to you whatever solution you prefer. Watercolor definitely is an unpredictable medium, so don't forget, when starting out, you will most likely throw a lot of practice sheets of paper, and that's fine and completely natural. I just wouldn't waste the highest quality materials for it. At the same time, take a bit of care when choosing the first set of art supplies for watercolor, as the bad ones will most likely cause you to stop trying and assuming that the problem is you. And I would definitely want you to enjoy watercolor painting process as much as I do and keep on developing your skills in this area. And we're all set, and I will see you next Thursday in the second episode of this watercolor mini series, which will be about basic watercolor techniques. If you enjoyed this video, if it helped you in any way, consider subscribing, like the video, give me a comment or a thumbs up, and I'll see you next Thursday. Bye bye!